said, hey, I've heard some people that some of you have been a little unhappy, maybe the way that we've had access to, some things, like we used to be close and bonding. And what I wanted to help them understand was this isn't a problem. This is actually a real win. So less time with pastors, less time with staff, less time with personal social calls is not because we're losing, it's because God's adding. It's really nice to be back with Dean DeFeria on Christian Lee.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
We'd like to say hi to Christian Lee, wherever he is as well.
You're stealing my jokes now.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about today? Why did you bring me here?
Dean, tell me your thoughts on Elon Musk.
I did work for him.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
You are a former astro something.
I've been in his presence.
What was that like?
He's not very personable. Yeah, he actually was so bad at talking with people that he hired someone to come in to just help him converse with staff, because he would be there in the pizza line, early SpaceX, 10 people, and just freeze. He wouldn't know how to interact with them.
But you worked for the competition.
Well, I started doing work for him.
Oh,
so
and then
Crew Dragon.
You're a traitor.
Yeah, that's a fun fact. Every single astronaut that goes to space through SpaceX has parts on that rocket and on that capsule that I built, which is really cool.
That is pretty cool. Yeah. Unless it explodes, and then you feel the guilt forever.
Yeah, that's why I'm thankful I didn't do any work for Boeing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we went there.
Question for you, though. This is something people need to know. You come out of that life, high-profile job, high-profile company, and now here you are in ministry. I think people should know that. That was a big step. You say no to that life, young, wife's a doctor, and now here you are sitting across the table from me doing this.
A sidestep?
Thank you.
I think we'll go with a sidestep, an upgrade. Absolutely an upgrade.
I just think it's incredibly encouraging for other young people and for older people too, to see that there are still young men who say, forget the world, man. There is a reality when, and I don't know how it works, where you go, man, I don't care how much money I make. I don't care how I live. I just want to do that with the rest of my life. Yep. It happens.
And it was so obvious. I mean, I had a conversation with Megan, right? We go off to a lake in Lake Forest. Did you know that there's actually a lake in Lake Forest? And we were jotting down, the pros and cons. Let's rationally look at this. And it just came down to looking at all of it and going, okay, but how do I stand before the Lord and say, I know you gave me that opportunity. I know you changed my desires that week, and I decided not to.
And now that everyone knows our life story and your calling, we are actually going to have a podcast on something.
All right, so let's talk church size dynamics. It's this interesting aspect of church. It's a reality. We all face it. We all know it, that you visit a church of 100 and it's going to be a certain way. And you visit a church of 2,000 and it's going to be a different way, a very different way. I mean, it's been noticed by many that, within the same denomination, if you have two churches that are lockstep theologically, but 2,000 people apart, right? 1,000 and 2,000 plus. I mean, those churches are worlds apart when you visit them. But then if you get churches of different denominations of the same size, they're not that different. Your experience, your subjective feel when you walk in is in that way. So I figured you'd be helpful to talk about this. You planted Mission Bible Church 15 years ago, and it was not the 1,000, 1,500 people plus as it is today.
True.
I don't even know, did you need two hands to count your attendance?
No, we had 4 people.
You had 4 people?
4 people.
What's amazing is that
2
family,
of them was my wife and I.
Well,
so 2 other people.
Well, so those 2 are here, but the other 2 are still here.
There are 6 of I think out of the original 40, there's 8 families or 6 families still here.
That is incredible.
It really is. I just texted them the other day because I saw a picture of our first children's ministry, 6 kids, their kids were all in it. And they're still here. And I texted them, I said, I love you. Thanks for being willing to do this journey. Because it was not easy. It is not, but.
What's helpful to look at is that it's not like you just 10x'd or 100x'd in size and everything else was the same. Everything is radically different from how you lead a church of 10 to a church of 1,000, how you run administrative events, how you staff, if you can even staff.
No, it goes back even further than that, because before we came here, I grew up in a larger church, and then I had a church I served at that was 6,000. College ministry was 2,000. And so things are drastically different methodologically along the way. I think the interesting thing about mission is we got to experience every single phase.
Right.
And kind of enjoy that process of learning along the way. One of the things to remember in church growth conversations, though, and this would be so important, is not to focus on methodology at the expense of theology. So there are absolutes that God gives us which are always foundational. So you think about a church, right? And you've got as a pastor, you've got the desire for the work, 1 Timothy 3:1. There's no pity parties. So some of these things are really clean and clear in Scripture. No pity parties for pastors. A lot of times we develop martyr syndromes. It's like, oh, woe is me. No one likes me. Everybody hates me. I guess I'll go eat worms. And I think number 2 is there's a qualification list, which we talked about, I think, last time. 1 Timothy 3. You got to meet that. Mm-hmm. But then also what you are aiming to do is pretty clear. When you start breaking down the feeding, the leading, and the equipping, and protecting's in there as well. First Timothy 5, 1 Peter 5, Acts chapter 20, and Ephesians 4. And you realize, okay, no matter what else we do, these things have to happen. But what gets subjective is that not the what's there, but it's how it works. So based on culture, based on the size of the church, how those things work change. But I think that's an important part to the conversation, so that you don't ever get the accusation that you're a pragmatist or something like that.
Right. We're living in the world of prudence. You're called to be a steward, a caretaker, a manager. And so what does rationality, what does reasonableness and wisdom and counselors and experience and observation tell you? Here's the best way to manage and oversee a church of this size.
That's right. Yeah.
And even in that, then we want to be careful that I think it's absolutely fair that we have preferences of church size, of church types. Because that's a personal preference on methodology. But we want to be careful, just like you mentioned, that we're not talking about theology, black and white scripture, that if we go, hey, for me personally, I like a church that's this size or that's this kind of feel, that's okay, as long as we remember this is a personal preference of mine.
Sure. Begin to idolize church size. My church is right because, that happens all the time. And I think it's helpful to remember that the reason there are so many shapes and sizes, 98% of American churches are under 200 or under, because there really is a sweet spot of a church of 200 where you're going, hey, I get just as much of the pastor as I would need or want. We've got just enough of a congregation to accomplish some level of impact in the community. And so, part of the reason I think that the Lord has provided so many options is not just because people say, well, it's because of schism. And no, I think it's because he knows his people are unique and they have different expressions and different ways that they want to come together and enjoy him.
But then there can be difficulty that comes when a church grows.
Yep.
The word is preached faithfully and more people around are hearing, getting converted, attending. And what everyone loved, that perfect temperature pool, is now changing.
You betcha.
It's getting bigger.
Especially for the people who are a part of that change.
Yeah.
Or development.
Yep.
You betcha. I think you look at different categories, 0 to 100, for example. Most times a church under 100 isn't thinking about hiring a full-time pastor. And so you start working through pros and cons. Like if you take every category of a church's health development, we'll call it that, you just end up with certain pros and cons. So a church of 0 to 100 is going, hey, not looking for anybody. Around 75, 100, maybe want to hire somebody, still bivocational, part-time and whatever. And people are typically happy meeting in a home. But then when you get into that 100 to 200 range, you have a full-time guy. Now things are interesting. The pros are he's always around. He's a big teddy bear. Mm-hmm. He's in the hospital. He's doing every wedding and every funeral. In fact, he would take it as a personal offense if he wasn't doing the wedding for your daughter, right? Now, the cons of that are obvious too. You're probably renting your facility. You probably don't have the best music. You probably are, you're probably not going to attract typically young families. So especially with youth.
Because your kids' ministry is not going to
You don't really have one,
there.
and if you do...
You probably don't have a youth pastor.
You don't have...
Or you're stretching your main pastor very thin.
Exactly. And so I think that's important to remember, that the 0 to 100, for example, has beautiful blessings and unique characteristics, but it comes with its own set of challenges or cons on the ROI side. And so those are just decisions that you make as a family.
Well, and it's hard to do things. You want to be missional. You want to support missions. You want to support missionaries. You name it, budget becomes a very top point of conversation.
Typically, though, you don't get into massive budget conversations at the organic level, the house church level, because your overhead is pretty much covered.
Yep.
You're not paying hard cost on salary. You're not paying for a building. You don't really have programmatic expenses. All the food is potluck. So you don't really hit budgeting issues until you jump into that next category, 200 to 400. And I think that's interesting, because then when you move into that category, suddenly you've got a whole new set of pros and cons.
Right.
The pros are, and I think this is the reason that 90+% of churches are that size, is you get the best of community at that level. There's been so many studies done, I forget what they were, Malcolm Gladwell probably, that any individual can pretty much in his life care for and love a community of about 200. So if you look at most people, if they write down everyone they know, people that are considered friends and family, it's about 200. Which is interesting because pockets of community going all the way back to clan structures in the Old Testament, you can always find these structures of about 200. And so I think that's why churches tend to pocket there. But by 200, you may have a youth program of some kind. Your pastor still knows your name. Your literature starts to improve. I mean, before he was doing the bulletins and the janitorial work, and now you might be able to have some help on that.
But you named it programs. Programs start, and you need administrative help.
Yep, and I think at that level, 200 to 400 is where you begin to feel the rub a little bit on some of that, because people are going, hey, pastor used to always be available for a social visit. And suddenly now he's not. He'll still do counseling, and he'll still visit you in the hospital, but he's not available the way that he was. And so to your point, you start to feel a few of those tensions kick in.
Because he's delegating. Well, he's forced to delegate.
Yep.
He can't do everything.
Yep.
And still take care of his home.
That's right. And he'll hire a part-time guy. Sometimes you'll get a part-time youth guy at that level. But where I think the biggest threshold change is when you move 400 to 800, typically. Because now the church is moving into a small business category, the way that it operates.
Ooh.
And that's where people feel it the most. Suddenly your pastor moves more to, it's like a small business owner. He's showing up at certain days. He's doing membership classes. There's now a staff that has to be cared for. So you're enculturating that group. You can support missionaries. You have programs that reach the community. So your church becomes a place where the music tends to be excellent, to where people are going, I'm excited to invite my neighbors to the church at that level. But what you give up then at that point is now your pastor may know the members, but he doesn't know your kids. And he's not doing home visits anymore. I remember for us when that happened, when we came out of COVID and we crossed through that, that number, that 400, 800 category, I remember telling Cindy at the time, I said, hey, things are growing so much. And even with attrition, you're having to add 100 people a year or so just to keep up, with growth, which means your membership classes start to fill up. Yep. And I remember telling Cindy, I said, hey, let's do something. Over the course of the next year, whatever it is, every Friday night, I want, my family with somebody in the church, somebody new, right? So she goes, I think we were booked out like 2 years, where at least once or twice a week, I'm packing up the family and we're hitting in and out with somebody, because I wanted to try to wrap my arms as much as I could around those new people. And I think that's where what's interesting about 400, 800 is like a small business owner. Your pastor is right there with the new people. You might get to meet him up front. And then all the systems kind of kick in the back. And that's where you really have to be okay at that level with being equipped by non-pastors. Whether that's Sunday school or small groups, your systems begin to take over. And then that's right there at 800. When you break into 800 and above, that's where people feel it the most, because you literally can't begin to run a church of 800 without heavy admin. It's system-based. And then really 1,200 on, and there's been a lot of studies done on this, 1,200 on, 2,000, 3,000, that mega church vibe, if you want to call it that, really becomes a mini town. And so what you're gaining with that larger church is programs, activities, life stage.
Quality.
Alignment. You could argue quality at different levels.
Okay. But quality is expected and assured at that step.
Expected and assured. You are guaranteed alignment. The vision casting is going to typically be clean. Your messaging is going to be simple. You're going to know exactly what you should do. Point 1, point 2, point 3. And you think about, hey, what should my family do to be obedient? Well, here it is. There's no question about your role.
Right.
I think overall, larger churches provide a lot of positive. The one thing you give up, there's two things you think you give up. One of them you actually do. The one thing that you think you give up is being known, is knowing people. You feel alone. But that's only if you're choosing to keep Sunday as like a one-time initiative.
Yep.
Instead of the entire week as an all-time, all the time engagement, where you're going, no, I'm not just going to church, I'm part of the church. Most churches that are large have great onboarding, great assimilation. They've got great discipleship options. You just have to engage it. And so I don't think that's necessarily true. Although I do think the one thing that is true is you're not involved, you're not able to speak into ministry philosophy in a large church. And so if you are a person, you're like, hey, I really have some views, and I rightfully so, even I want to be heard. I have gifts that I want to use in a certain way, maybe strategically. I think that's the hard part. Once you get to a large church, typically you've got a group of elders, you've got deacons, you've got a board strategy, and everything's running. And so you don't get as much say as you would have in a smaller church. And so I think every category has pros. I think it's got cons. I think the most difficult thing is not going to a church and liking it. Probably the most difficult thing I have found is that when people are growing through those stages with you and you're having to make organizational structural changes, and people are going, oh, I felt that. I mean, a staff, for example, when you break from 400 to 800, you're going to have to immediately make a shift from a basketball team mentality to a football team mentality. You just do.
Right, there's a real org chart now.
Well, sure. There's a basketball team vibe when you're planting a church, which is like, man, it might be a point guard, but we're all doing this together, and there's interchangeable roles. Yep. And suddenly now it's coach, quarterback, there's a team, we're all siloed and we're all running our play. And people feel that. Sometimes even intrinsically, they don't know what it actually is. And it takes a lot of patience to walk with people through those changes.
Because there's nostalgia. Hey, back in the day when I wanted to put on a barbecue, I could call my pastor and he'd be there. Well, now church is tripled, quadrupled in size. I don't have that opportunity. He's busy. I'm talking to his administrator, his assistant, instead of him directly. And that can cause some pain. That you got to work through that emotionally.
Yeah, and you have history too. It's not just that was objectively true. It was relationally true. Like, we used to operate this way together. And so now that's what I know. That has changed, and maybe I'm not even aware of the change or hasn't been communicated well, to your point. And now I'm going, what happened? And so I think those realities are what can be difficult as a church grows.
You talked about, as the church gets larger, vision being set. That was notably absent in the smaller church. Is that because it allows the smaller church, there's a bit more democracy? People have opinions, they have ministries, and it's because there's only one pastor. It's great, go run that way. But when you have a church of 1,000, 2,000, you can't just have every member run a direction they want.
Well, it depends on your polity.
Okay. So, right.
But there's very few congregational churches, for example, that are going to be larger than 1,000.
Yep.
Just for those obvious reasons, right? But yeah, I think there's ways to include a congregation in a larger church setting in choices. But yeah, to your point, a lot of those strategic decisions are made a year in advance.
So then in the context of a growing church, people are coming, they're hearing the word preached. How do you balance tradition, keeping it like it was, but innovating to account for growth?
I think that's always a challenge. What you're trying to help people, we're all trying to do is honor the past, but not revere it. Does that make sense? Everything that we do comes from somewhere. And that's part of heritage. I mean, even church history, like we're attached to something. And so I think showing honor to that so that people understand you're not out here floating alone. There's an ancestry. But the one constant in life is change, technological developments. And I think it's important to help people understand that just because we did it a certain way today doesn't mean it has to be done that way tomorrow. Not theology, that doesn't change, but methodology may change and develop. And so really helping people work through those two realities and be nuanced in them.
And this is just a reality of life. I liked to do things a certain way when I was a child, but then I put away those childish things. Or, a couple who's dating likes to do things a certain way, but now they have kids. Well, they don't get to do those same things in the same way. This is just reality. Change is inevitable.
Yeah.
So then how do you focus? You talked about you start out small church, one guy's doing everything. Big church, one guy can't do everything. What's an effective way to be building up the lay side? The non-employed leaders of the church to be disciple makers and leaders within that church?
We have to if the church is going to grow.
Right.
So number one, it's obedience. We're equipping. Number two is we have to if we want to touch more lives. That's part of scaling. I think the key to development of lay leaders is letting them fail. If you go, hey, I did this at 100%, and the next guy that is going to come on board, I need them to do it at 100%, you're never going to probably get there. But if you say, hey, let's start at 60% or 50%, and then you let them grow to 70 to 80%, and you let them run, then that's okay. That's okay. And so I think letting people fail, letting them experiment, walking with them, not cutting people too quick if they have a hard time figuring it out. Because a paid pastor was probably going to devote 60 hours a week to ministry, right? So think about that. That's 60 hours full time. But then you go, hey, I've got a guy who now is working 50 hours for orbit, like you as a rocket scientist. And now I'm asking him to lead a discipleship group, teach a Sunday school class, and show up and help with security on a Sunday, another 10 to 12 hours. Plus he's being asked to do family devotions. Plus so you start to work that out and you go, in the real world, why would I ever ask somebody else to do more work than I would be able to do? And I'm paid for this full time. And so really right-sizing our expectations of volunteers and lay leaders so that they can run the marathon and not the sprint and always feel that we're staring down at them, upset and angry from our ivory tower.
Yeah, and that can be hard because you've built this, right? If you're that solo pastor, that this has been God through you building and everything is dialed into your preference, and then you hand it off and the guy fails or doesn't do it the same way. I mean, that requires such a loosening of our hands.
Well, and we tend to be zealots as preachers and pastors, but even more so as planters. So a church planter, there's guys who are placed or take ministry positions tend to have a certain ethos about them, whereas planters so it's like a homesteader and a pioneer. A pioneer is a guy who's going out and he's got this edge to him where he's fiercely independent. He's like an entrepreneur for Christ. And he says, I'm going to hit the Oregon Trail and I don't know where this thing's going to end, but it's going to be some town in the middle of nowhere. I'll fight off the Indians to get here. And it is hard because you have no infrastructure to support you. But a homesteader is somebody who comes in behind when there's the land rush, takes the stake and says, hey, they've given us all parcels, I'm just going to step out and I'm going to help everyone. I want the town to grow safe. And I want there to be a sheriff and a deputy, and I want everything. So what happens for planters is we're so zealous, we forget that not anybody is going to have the same zeal per se as we do. Right? Like, so I'm going to wake up and I'm going to go to bed, eat, sleep, and drink church. One of the dangers is I can actually overemphasize that for everybody else. And so then what you end up with is a bunch of outlaws at the beginning who are like, oh, Oregon Trail with you. But that's not sustainable. These are real people with real families. And so you might get a few young guns. They might be single and 22, but that's not sustainable. Your church can't last because you can't pay them what they need to live in California. You end up with a few females who are already working at the coffee shop and they'll help you on the side. And so you have to figure out how to work with every category in such a way that real people with real lives and real responsibilities can wake up with joy. That takes patience.
Well, and then when you're elevating, you're delegating, you're lowering your expectation from 100% from yourself to 80% at the highest, maybe 60%, 40 to start. You're building up. Your ministry is not, it doesn't lessen, it just changes. As far as where you were doing that work itself, now you're pouring into those people who are pouring into others.
Yes.
And so your work's not done. It's up to you that your delegate grows and gets better.
It almost gets harder because if you take a pie chart, picture a circle, the cut of the pie changes. At the beginning, it's very simple. It's like you may have a little bit for preaching and you got a whole bunch of people time, right? And then it begins to change and you have to measure not only the change, and that's something you have to come to almost it's like an existential reality crisis. You have to come to that. Then you have to coach the people through that reality every step of the way. Hey, the pie chart is changing, right? Now, remember the absolutes. These are what they are. These have to happen. But our church has grown. You see the one, don't we all? I remember I had a meeting. Do you remember that membership meeting where I actually said, hey, I've heard some people that some of you have been a little unhappy about maybe the way that we've had access to, some things, like we used to be close and bonding. I said, but can you all just raise your hand if you are super jacked about the 118 new members that are in this room right now, just from this last calendar year and that membership meeting? And then everyone raised their hand. And I said, now, aren't you thankful that they're here? And they're like, yeah. And I said, new people, aren't you thankful that they were here and they built this for you? And what I wanted to help them understand was this isn't a problem. This is actually a real win. So less time with pastors, less time with staff, less time with personal social calls is not because we're losing, it's because God's adding. And so I think that's part of it, helping people process.
Yeah, so much of it comes down to that That ethic of Philippians 2, hey, if we're going to be of one mind, then I need to figure out what's a personal preference, and I need to be willing to lay it down for the sake of unity, for the sake of the body. It's the only way that we can advance for the mission that Christ has called us to. So if that's all happening, church is growing in number, how do you keep making sure that there's spiritual growth happening in the church?
That brings us right back to where we started. Keep the main thing the main thing. The absolutes are, right? Feeding, leading, protecting, and equipping. And so your key indicators for success as a church, as a team, as a staff need to be those. We have to make sure if we're measuring something, it's not just behinds and seeds. It's who are we feeding? Who are we leading? Who are we protecting? Are they being equipped? And if we can verify that, then the beauty is, based on the word of God, we're able to literally put our head on the pillow and eventually breathe our final breath and go, Lord, as far as it depends on me, as far as what I know on the earthly level, motives, that's between me and you very soon. Yeah. But on an earthly level, I think that we were faithful.
But that's so important. You can lay your head down on the pillow well, and you can sleep well when you remember it's not about the numbers. It's not about how much you raised. It's not about how many people attended. It's, was I faithful to the text? Did I do the work so that I could raise people up to do the work of ministry, Ephesians 4? Was I faithful to the Lord? Well, then I can be happy and content.
Amen.
Hey, thank you for joining us for this episode of Christianly. I hope that you loved it, that it was your favorite episode ever, but even if it wasn't and you liked it, I think that's pretty good. Let us know down below what you enjoyed. We would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes, make sure to let us know. You can, again, comment below, or you can message us on Instagram @ChristianlyPodcast.